I want to talk a little bit about working with headhunters, and it's really important that you understand how executive search and recruitment firms work. Generally speaking, these firms fall into two categories. You have recruitment firms, which are often what we call contingent recruiters. They get paid a fee if they are successful. And that creates a few challenges with their process. That often means they've got to move very quickly. They've got to send CVs over to the company very quickly. They've got to really react because it's a highly competitive recruitment process, and they'll only get a fee if they successfully place the candidate. Now, there are some good contingent recruiters around the country, but they've got a real sort of line of sight into how they're going to operate, and you need to be aware of how they operate. And you want to do some research on these firms and find out who's a good operator, who's a good recruiter, who has a lot of work on, who has a lot of volume of assignments, who could be a good fit for you. And often word of mouth can work quite well. On the other side, you have executive search firms, and typically an executive search firm is retained by the company to find top talent. There's usually a lot more of a process involved. It's not competitive. They haven't given the brief to 5 different companies. It's usually with one company, and they've usually paid quite a substantial retainer to engage that firm. Just to understand how recruitment fees work, typically the company gets paid 1/3 of the first year's salary as the recruitment fee. So in the case of a senior executive, if you're on a $300,000 package, the recruitment fee is about $100,000. So companies don't engage with recruitment firms or executive search firms lightly. They're doing it very deliberately, and because they trust that firm to take the person's, the various candidates through a proper process, do all the screening, make the recommendations and so on. It is imperative that you have a good relationship with headhunters throughout this whole process. And I get a lot of feedback from my clients. They get very negative about recruiters because they don't return telephone calls. They sometimes don't give feedback. They can sometimes be very difficult to get on the phone. But the reality is you've got to kind of put that attitude aside, because they could be the key to your success. And it may be that you have a lot of bad experiences with recruiters, and then you have one brilliant experience and they put you forward for a role. If they're retained by the company, you cannot circumvent them. You can't go around a headhunter and get to the employer. You have to trust in the process, so that if the company has retained that company, they're not going to take very kindly to you going direct and sending your CV across, thinking that you know better than the recruiter and you want to, try and chase down that opportunity. So you've got to trust the process, and you've got to be very respectful, particularly of executive search firm consultants. They're often very much involved in the recruitment process from beginning to end, and they're watching everything that you do and say on every phone call, every email, every interaction. So you really have to be putting your best foot forward. So don't think you can be a little bit rude to a headhunter and that doesn't translate to you being dropped from a short list. You've really got to be very polite, watch your P's and Q's throughout the whole cycle. As I said, they can be, they can be absolute door openers though, and it can be, just an absolute fantastic experience getting in with the right headhunter who really takes a bit of a personal interest in you and will guide you through an entire recruitment process with the company. Keep in mind that recruitment processes never get sped up to accommodate a single candidate in the process. So I know you might want feedback, and I know you might want to know if you've been shortlisted, or you might want to, hurry the process along because, another offer is coming through. I appreciate all of that, but the company will never speed that process up. And, it's a bit of a mistake to think that they're going to accommodate an individual. They want to go through a strict process to identify the best candidate. So we need to understand that. That's really key to understanding the whole recruitment process. You also need to understand what the headhunter is looking for in the recruitment process. So when they bring you in for a screening interview, they very rarely bring you in for a screen unless they've got a specific role they've got in mind for you. Particularly in challenging economic circumstances, they just won't waste the time to do a coffee chat. So even if they make it sound very relaxed, if a recruiter has brought you in for an interview, there is a job brief. They won't tell you about the brief unless they're 100% certain that you're the right candidate for the job. So you have to understand that. There's a process they're going through. But they're going to screen you and they're going to be asking some general questions to ascertain whether you're the right person for that job. Now, I can assure you there are no dumb questions in that process. Those questions are very much related to the position that they're recruiting for. So pay attention to the questions you're being asked. But there's usually 4 or 5 key things that are going to come up. The headhunter is going to want to know roughly what you're doing in terms of your job search, how you're going about your job search. Headhunters get very nervous when your CV is all over town. If you're with every recruiter, your CV's already been sent to companies and so on. So you want to play your cards very close to your chest. You do not want to disclose that your CV has been sent to a wide number of employers. That will make a recruiter, a good recruiter, a little bit nervous because they'll be very worried that you may be a bit scattergun with your approach. Maybe you're being rejected by companies and not being taken forward. So you want to play that very carefully when they ask you about how you're going about your job search. You'd probably say something like, look, I've only just commenced the search. You're one of the first companies that I'm speaking with. I'm being very deliberate about the types of roles I'm applying for because I really want to make sure I make a good career decision. So you want to come across very polished and very focused on your career search. Second thing headhunters are going to want to try and screen is, are you actually as good as you say you are on paper? The fundamental responsibility of the recruiter is to assess that there is no candidate fraud taking place here. And I hate to say that, but the reality is many people lie on their resumes. They lie about companies they've worked for, they lie about dates, they lie about their education. They think they can get away with, a little bit of creative license, and usually you can't. So you need to be very careful that your resume is a factual document in the first place. But keep in mind the headhunter is there to screen and to make sure that the resume is accurate. And so they'll ask you a number of questions to ascertain that. They may ask you, did you remember working with Bill Smith at XYZ company? There's no dumb questions in these processes. They're screening, they're cross-checking, they'll be verifying information. They will make it seem very relaxed, but the reality is they're there to screen. Do you have the right skills, the competencies, the experience, and is the resume accurate? So there'll be a process of questions that they'll go through. The next thing they're going to work out is what are your salary expectations. The last thing a headhunter wants to do is to put you forward for a role where your salary expectations are too high and or that your salary expectations are too low. And they won't put forward, a candidate that's earning $100,000 forward for a $500,000 role. That just won't happen. So you need to be very clear about your salary expectations going into these conversations and how you're going to present that information in the right light so that you can be obviously represented correctly as they take you forward through the recruitment process. So it's usually best to be honest, but you need to maybe think about how you present your package. Was it the right package in the first place? Do you need to add a little bit more so that you get a little bit of a pay rise or pay lift? You need to think about how you position that information, because once you've disclosed it, you can't change it. So you need to get that right. And then finally, they're screening for cultural fit. And this is where, again, there's no dumb questions. They'll be asking, would you like to work with this type of company? What type of people do you like to work with? They'll be trying to screen if you are a good fit. Now, assuming this conversation has gone well, by the end of the sort of interview, they should be starting to talk about some roles. They should be saying things like, well, look, we think you'd be a very good fit for the role that we're recruiting for at XYZ company. We've got a job description we'd like to get to you so you can review it, and then we'll take it to the next step. That is a very positive sign. If the executive search firm wants to share with you an actual job description, that is a sign that they're considering you very seriously to be shortlisted. If they do not give you a job description, it's very unlikely you're being shortlisted. Okay, so headhunters can be very polite and they don't want to reject you because they might want to consider you for another role. And they may not give you exactly the full truth of the situation, that they're not going to shortlist you for this particular role. So you just need to be mindful, and there's no point getting upset about this. This is just the way this process works. And you need to think about it from the search firm's perspective. They don't want to reject candidates, but they do want to keep in touch with a talent pool. And you may be right for this role, you may not be right. I generally speaking don't get too upset if the company doesn't want to shortlist me for a role, because they know their client best. They usually know the culture of the business. They've probably recruited for the company several times, and in which case they do have some insight into who would be a good fit, and whether you like it or not, how you're presenting in that interview is giving them clues about whether you would be a good fit to go forward. Now, this leads me on to what is probably the saddest reality of the recruitment process. The person who interviews the best gets the job. The person who has the best skills, experience, and capabilities, if they don't interview well, will not succeed. And this is where we're heading into now. Probably the most important part of this program is understanding the interview process, because you can have the best resume and that gets you in the door, but if you don't interview well, you're going to struggle. And the problem we now have is that interview processes have become extremely complex. You've got to meet with the headhunter to get to the client. When you get to the client, you've got to meet with the HR director before they'll let you loose with the executive team. When you've met with the executive team, you sometimes have to meet with several different divisions of the business before you're employed. Then they want to put you through psychometric testing and then do reference checks. This is a very complex process, and so we've really got to arm you with the right information so that you perform well. But I think I've given you enough of an insight about headhunters. They can be your friend. They can be an incredible conduit to the most amazing jobs. Never ever fall out with a headhunter, even if they've not shortlisted you and you thought they should have, even if they're rude to you and they don't return your telephone calls or they don't give you feedback. Never fall out with a headhunter. You never know when you might need them or come across them again in a recruitment process. And generally speaking, they are an incredible conduit to amazing jobs and opportunities.